Hi everybody. This week we'll be working with Python. Next I'll discuss with you some of the key differences between Python and a language like processing or JavaScript. But before we do that, you should first know that all of the sort of basic programming fundamentals like variables, conditionals, iteration, functions, and even classes are all present in Python as they are in processing, just with some slight differences. Let's get started. Okay, here we have on the left a processing sketch, and on the right some Python code. These two examples do exactly the same thing, but what's immediately noticeable is that the Python code is much more compact and efficient, in part because Python doesn't use the structural functions that processing does, including setup and draw. The next important distinction between Python and processing has to do with variables. In Python, variables are dynamically typed, which means that their data type is not strictly defined and can change. This has pluses and minuses, but I do think dynamically typed languages are easier to work with in general. JavaScript is another example of a dynamically typed language. Here you can see in processing that we've defined the data type for this variable using the keyword int. However, in Python, we just begin using the variable. The same thing applies to functions in Python. Here is a function definition. But we don't need to define a return type. We can just use the def keyword and leave it at that. In processing, we have to define a specific return type for that function. Here we're using the keyword int. That means that this function can only return values of the data type int. One other distinction between Python and languages like processing and JavaScript is that in processing, you have to end each statement with a semicolon. However, in Python, the semicolon is strictly optional and generally discouraged, so unless you find it easier for some reason, don't include it. Another important distinction is that in Python, logical operators are the actual English word, for example, and, whereas in processing we use a double ampersand. Also notice that the if statement in Python does not make use of parentheses. There's another important distinction having to do with Python with regard to whitespace. By whitespace, I'm referring to the tabs that we sometimes include in programs. In processing in JavaScript, the tabs don't make a difference, but we often include them because it makes it easier for us to see the program. In Python, the tabs are vitally important and change the structure of the program. By removing the whitespace like this, I'm actually changing how the program will behave. In order for this program to work the way I intend it to, I'm going to return the whitespace to the way I originally had it. To run this Python program, I'll need to use a command line. On the Mac, the application is called Terminal. On Windows, you'll need to use the command prompt. I'm going to launch the terminal now. All Macs come with an older version of Python by default. On Windows, you may need to install it first. To run the program, I can just type python space example.py and then hit return. And there's the result. This assumes that I've saved an example.py file into my user folder. If I've saved the file somewhere else, I'll need to navigate there first before running the Python command in the terminal. Use the command cd to accomplish this. And by the way, you can use any text editor to create Python files. Before you panic too much about Python and the command line, this week's assignment is pretty straightforward. I just want you to go to codecademy.com and complete the Python course. Post a screenshot of your progress on the documentation blog. You can probably do better than 2%. Get as far as you can, but make it at least as far as the loops lesson. Next week we'll use Python to scrape data from various social media websites. Until then, know that you can always reach out to us if you're having a coding crisis. Good luck!